Welcome to our Calvinian architecture. Today I'm reading from 7th octave, 2nd chapter. The city is Andria, and I'm reading verse 3, story about a house I wanted to buy, but yet again I didn't. Verse 3. I'm not sure where I saw it now, the ad. Might have been in the Age. Usually is, or could have been somewhere else. But it jumped out at me as soon as I read it. That's what I remember about it, the way it described the house and the forest around it at the foot of the Great Western Tiers. I was scheduled to fly to Bangkok 2 days later, and I had so much to get ready, so much to prepare, myself mostly. But I called Tasmania anyway and spoke to Val. I remember putting the phone down and leaving my hand on the receiver. If I'd taken it off, I would never have done the next thing I did, but I didn't take it off. I just lifted it again and called Qantas to see how many frequent flyer points I had. Enough was the answer for a return flight to Launceston. I booked a flight for the following day at 10 a.m. Val picked me up from the airport. She was 70, had lived all her life around that part of Tasmania and built her dream house when she retired from work. Now she had cancer, she told me, and simply couldn't keep up with all that needed to be done around the property. We sped through Launceston suburbs, then through small country towns that seemed like they belonged to another decade, another century. We stopped in one and bought bread, tomatoes and cheese. Soon we were driving under the tiers, ancient limestone formations that cut Tasmania in two. We drove into a forest, and then we were in a drive winding past huge gums, a small orchard, and a vegetable garden, to a clearing where the house stood. We sat in the veranda upstairs and ate cheese and tomato sandwiches and drank tea. Val was a landscape painter. She'd come to the forest to paint, she said. Her landscapes dotted the walls and were stacked up in rows. Against them, monochrome paintings that captured a kind of immobility, a stillness, a silence. She told me she'd bought a house in nearby Deloraine, whose garden was bare except for a single rose bush. I looked around at the multitude of trees and flowering shrubs she'd planted here on the ponds and the stone-lined paths she'd built. What will you do, Val, without such a garden? I asked. Well, I'll just start again, won't I? She answered, as though it was the simplest and most logical thing in the world. She took me up to the highest point of the 26 acres, looking east down the valley. I've seen the sunrise here each morning for the last 10 years, she said quietly. We walked around the perimeter of the property and sat in silence on the veranda again for a last cup of tea. It seemed as though we'd known each other forever. She told me a little about her one daughter who lived in Deloraine and had survived an unhappy marriage. I talked a little of my life. Time to go, Domenico, otherwise you'll miss your flight, she said suddenly, looking at her watch. She drove me back to the airport at Launceston and stood at the gate and waved until the plane taxied onto the runway and took off back to Melbourne. We spoke on the phone a few times, me downstairs at Ruin Indra, while cars were being parked, people registered at the desk, and dogs yapped insistently. From her end, just silence beyond her still voice. I simply couldn't raise the money for what in the end was an extremely reasonable price. She called me one Sunday morning to tell me that a couple had just come from Melbourne and had stayed the night. It had been a full moon, and clearly The house was their dream house. Val told me how he'd proposed marriage to his partner as they all sat on the upstairs veranda, watching the moon come up over the tiers. She'd accepted, and Val had accepted their offer for the house. "I thought you'd like to know, Domenico," she said slowly, "that I think that we love the house as much as you would have." There was a silence, I could hear it, that silence rising up all the way from the valleys and the creeks, from the orchard and the vegetable garden, from the 3 pools she'd built, from the paintings stacked up against the walls. The silence said almost everything. The thing it couldn't say was what Val said next. "It wasn't really about the house, was it, Domenico? You didn't really come to Tasmania just for that, did you?" "No, Val, it wasn't, and I didn't," I answered. We kept in touch a bit after that, but I haven't heard from her for a while. I sent her some information a few months ago about a project I was working on, and it's not like her to not answer. I don't want to call her daughter to find out if she's still around. I prefer to think of her working round that single rose bush in a back street in Deloraine. I really do. Anyway, I'm sure I'll hear from her one of these days. Any one of these days. I won't read any more today. That happened a long time ago, over 20 years ago, and suddenly I'm thinking about that rose bush, which I'm sure Val turned into a rose garden. And there's no point right now to read another story. I hope you have a peaceful afternoon. Until tomorrow, when I'll be reading from the 7th octave, the 4th, the 3rd chapter. The city is Cecilia.